Maybe you've seen this iconic image of justice. Her eyes are covered because justice is blind. Everyone is equal in the eyes of Lady Justice. But justice isn't just blind because she holds in her hands a set of scales and a sword. And that is because in our modern Western conception of justice, justice isn't really about fairness. Justice is about exchange. It's about compensation. And it's backed by force. Welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome back. We are reaching today our halfway point in the read-through of Murray Bookchin's The Ecology of Freedom. Today we are tackling chapters 5 and 6, The Legacy of Domination and Justice, Equal and Exact. And we are getting into it today. These are two very intense and very complex chapters. There's a lot to talk about today, but I will say congratulations if you have reached this point in the book. This is the halfway point officially, and if you've made it this far, you should really give yourself a pat on the back because it is fantastic. I understand that this book can be tough to get through. However, it's totally worth it. And there's a lot of stuff in these chapters. We're going to go through these fairly quickly today. I want to make this as accessible as possible. But there's a lot of material here. And so we'll skip over, for example, Bookchin's just side-swiping at Stoicism and his discussion of early Christianity. Some of these things are going to be referenced later on in the book, but I really, either way, really encourage you to kind of sit with these chapters and go through them properly because necessarily we're skimming over some of that extra stuff, and I think it's worth sitting with the full chapter. But congratulations for making this far. Either way, as always, check out the Patreon channel, patreon.com/champagneanarchism. You can find this and other past books, everything from Manufacturing Consent to Capitalism: A Ghost Story. Other books are up on that channel, and all of this main feed stuff is absolutely free. So go check that out, and don't forget to like, subscribe, comment. I love hearing your comments, and if you are a Patreon member already, thank you so much. It really, really helps support this channel. I love you very much. Now, let's get into this book. Last video, we went through 7 full themes to understand Bookchin's ideas about how the state rewrites our brains, and today we just have 4. And it's going to be a little bit more of a freewheeling discussion today because there are a lot of ways to tackle these 2 chapters. Personally, I think that the best way to do this is to literally just sit back and kind of think through it. We're not going to do the anthropological stuff that we did last time or necessarily kind of needle these criticisms in because these are some big concepts that we're getting into, 4 of them today. And it's worth just kind of sitting back and talking a little bit through them. You will come to your own conclusions. They won't be the same as my conclusions, and that is awesome. And I want to hear all about that either way. So the 4 things that we're going to talk about are morality, the state, freedom, and justice. And if those sound like the biggest questions of our modern age, it's because they are. So we're going to get really, really deep into these ideas today. And let's start with morality. Now, morality and this discussion of morality are going to underpin a lot of what's to come. We start chapter 5 by exploring the origins of morality. And Bookchin says that the hierarchical origins of morality begin in early organic society. Again, these are pre-literate, kind of Neolithic societies that haven't experienced the rise of the state yet, and they're just starting to find these early concentrations of hierarchy. And this is where Bookchin starts his story about morality. So morality begins with the patriarchy, is what Bookchin says. Now remember, we saw last time, and this is based on some shaky anthropology, but last time Bookchin made this claim about these early societies being egalitarian, right? Everyone is needed, so you value men and women equally. But as societies begin to get bigger and more established and start to go to war with each other, all of a sudden your society is heavily dependent on the men because you need warriors, you need strong defenders, and you need young defenders as well. So young men are prioritized in these early societies. And of course, we do have a development of patriarchy. We see that today in our current society. But Bookchin says that the early development of morality and hierarchical morality starts with the man, the dominance of the man in the family. And he draws on a couple things, mainly the Bible. So he uses the Bible to show that the father figure in a family had kind of absolute power in the family. You get something similar as well in kind of ancient Greek thought. In ancient Greece, sons had duties, but they didn't particularly have power. So the father is kind of the center of power and moral authority in the family. And by contrast, the mother diminishes in this kind of early relationship. So the mother becomes a figure of weakness. Patriarchal control of the family means that men must dominate women before they can dominate other men. And that's very important because by this process, women become identified both with nature, which is something that needs to be dominated, and with something that is weak, which is, again, something that needs to be dominated. If you're in a society that values strength above all, then this kind of makes sense, this sort of development. And so you have the identification of women with nature, but also with evil. And you get a lot of this in the Bible as well, because women are weak and represent everything that patriarchal morality absolutely despises in this concept. And so femininity becomes something evil, something that must be resisted by the male center of the moral universe in these early societies. And Bookchin says that this is what gives rise to some of the insane things that men do to affirm their supremacy. There's a quote where he says, this is kind of a long quote, but it's worth it. He says, "It is utterly impossible to understand why meaningless wars, male boastfulness, exaggerated political rituals, and a preposterous elaboration of civil institutions engulf so many different, even tribal societies, without recognizing how much these phenomena are affirmations of male activity and expressions of his supremacy." Think about that quote for a second, and Bookchin's larger point here, because I really think that he's onto something here. And I also think that this underpins a lot of modern life. Think about the world that we live in now. Think about the manosphere. Think about men's rights activists, those corners of YouTube that are telling you how to be a better man, that you need to dominate, that you should go and conquer. All of this is directed against women and projected idea of weakness. Our modern day masculinity, this idea of masculinity that's very, very much with us, is rooted in kind of a deep hatred of the self and a fundamental insecurity that is the heart of our moral understanding of the world. And this is what Bookchin recognizes. And he says it has its basis in early Neolithic society. And he could absolutely be right about that. Again, it's one of those things where I don't know if the anthropology or the history will ever be definitively settled. I don't know if you'll necessarily be able to trace this back to one particular point in time. However, what is undeniable is the effect that Bookchin is talking about. But there's another level to this. Bookchin makes the point that both men and women are kind of dropped into a moral system that denies their human nature, because we're not really meant to live like this. In this kind of system, women are deeply constrained and put in their particular role, and it's a very well-defined role and they must stick to that. But also men are similarly restricted and they also have to perform their role. And none of this is really natural, is what Bookchin is telling us. Bookchin believes in fundamental and inherent equality between both men and women. And listen, we're not getting into queer theory today. Let's take him at his word here. But Bookchin really believes that this is an unnatural way to live, and you need to enforce that. You need a power to come in and say, this is your role, this is your role. You need an apparatus to make sure that none of this falls apart, to make sure that men continue to dominate women and you don't fall into this trap of them understanding their own humanity. In other words, you need the state. What is the state? We talked about the state last time, and we will talk about it again and again and again. As we go through Bookchin and other books that come along, we will always talk about the state. But what the state actually is actually a bit of a hard question to answer. The state is more than a government. The government changes, but the state remains. The state is a form of human organization that reaches into every corner of our lives, from our politics to our personal lives, to the way that our brains literally organize our thoughts and think about the world. We talked a little bit about this last time. The epistemologies of rule is Bookchin saying the state has influenced the way that we perceive the world. The state is Leviathan from Thomas Hobbes. Bookchin says that the state is interwoven with society in ways that make society indistinguishable from the state. And if you want my favorite definition of the state, it comes from Erik Larson in his book, The Operating System, which is really worth a read. He says, the state is more than just government. It is a form of human organization that aspires to create an encompassing social, cultural, and functional environment for every one of its inhabitants, one built on wealth creation, enabling it to continuously expand and deepen its powers. Larson's argument in that book, which is well worth a read, is that the state is more of an operating system. It's very much like an operating system in a computer. It encompasses every way that we interact with the environment around us. Again, really good book, but back to Bookchin. Bookchin says that the state doesn't just appear. It doesn't appear out of nowhere. And a lot of attempts to say that sort of early in antiquity forms of government were the state or on the way to the state, they kind of miss the issue here. That's not quite right. Because Bookchin says the state is a graded phenomenon. It appears gradually over time. Power relations become institutionalized as the state develops. Because basically what you're doing here is you're going from a chief. The chief exerts personal influence, and people respect the chief because the chief has demonstrated that they should be respected. But you're going from that chief who has a deeply personal connection to the people that they're governing to a bureaucracy, which is literally faceless. The whole idea of bureaucracy is that you could replace anybody at that DMV or whatever, and it would function exactly the same way. Again, this is what I mean when I say power relations become institutionalized through the state. Now, the purpose of the state for Murray Bookchin is to clamp down on chaos, but it's a very particular type of chaos. And to understand the particular type of chaos, we have to understand the distinction that Murray Bookchin makes between direct democracy and direct action. And let's forget about representative democracy for just a second. So, direct democracy, which is everyone goes and votes on every issue. There is no representation. You're not voting for a representative who is then going to vote on something else. You are literally voting on everything. You are deciding everything, and you have a hand in every decision that happens in that society. And on the left, we tend to hold up the idea of direct democracy as kind of the ultimate goal, right? Direct democracy, it gives you the ability to have a say in what's going on. Bookchin supports this, but there's a little more to that, because what Bookchin says about direct democracy is it can be institutionalized. You can build an institution around direct democracy. You can make it a feature of a society. Direct action, on the other hand, which is what a lot of anarchists would kind of refer to as a state of permanent revolution, that cannot be institutionalized. So with direct action, you're not just voting for things to happen, but you are going to do things to make them happen. Decisions come about by consensus. There is no institutionalized framework for voting. None of that. From the perspective of the state, that's absolute chaos. And Bookchin says that capitalism and the rise of the market killed off any possibility of direct action, any possibility of a constant state of permanent revolution. Now, that is not to say that Bookchin is arguing against the direct democracy at all. In fact, we will see later on in this book and later on in Bookchin's own work that he actually believes in this institutionalization of direct democracy as a feature of direct democracy. So the fact that you can make it part of a fabric of a society is kind of a selling point for Bookchin. And he thinks that there are limits to direct action. There are limits to the chaos of what a lot of anarchists would really support. Bookchin is right about that, but does he go too far in the other direction? I think absolutely he does, but I will leave that to you, and we will talk so much more about this idea later on in the book, and so much more about the state, by the way, as we get into the second half of this book. So don't worry for now. We're just going to leave this as is, and that kind of closes out a little bit of chapter 5 We'll make reference to a lot of things that come up with these ideas in chapter 5 later on, but for now, let's move on to the concept of freedom. This is really, really fascinating. At the start of this, I should say that Bookchin places the ideas of freedom and justice in opposition to each other, and we will see why. And it kind of upends a lot of thinking that you may have done previously about concepts of justice, so stick with me here. Freedom, when it comes to freedom, Bookchin again refers back to early organic societies, those pre-literate societies. And he says, or his argument here, is that in many ways, a lot of the freedoms that we would consider to be freedoms now didn't really exist back in those early organic societies because the societies existed on the edge at all times. The notion of freedom back then didn't really exist. And modern freedoms were conscribed in a very particular way. So during a hunt, for example, you don't actually have any kind of freedom. Because if you don't do exactly what you are supposed to do, others who are out there hunting with you will suffer. Some of them may die. And so you have to act in a certain way. You do not have any freedom beyond that particular role in the hunt during that hunt. But once the hunt ends, and in other ways throughout these organic societies, Bookchin says that early organic societies had freedoms that we just have completely lost touch with. And that is very specifically because of one phrase that Bookchin's going to come back to. This is a pillar of his thought, and that is the idea of the irreducible minimum. Now, what is the irreducible minimum? Bookchin is borrowing from an anthropologist called Paul Radden, who was an absolute badass back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But the idea of the irreducible minimum is very powerful, and it goes something like this. No matter who you are, no matter what you do, no matter how you behave, you will always be entitled to certain bare minimum things, the irreducible minimum things. So things like food, things like water, shelter, we can think through what those things might be, and they will naturally change depending on what society you find yourself in. But these are essentially the means of life. And regardless of how hard you work, you just get these things. That's important because it's not given to you. This is just assumed that you have them. The society does not confer these things upon you. By virtue of being a member of the society, you don't therefore get these things. You're just there, and so of course you get those things. It's an assumed thing within the society. And by the way, speaking of this, it would be a mistake to think about the irreducible minimum things as being equivalent to our modern day understanding of human rights. Human rights come from this concept of justice that we're about to talk about in the fourth theme that we're going to talk about today. But justice is where most doctrines of human rights come from, and let's just kind of think through this for a second. As opposed to the irreducible minimum things, human rights are conferred by institutions. You can go to the UN and you can find a list of things that they decide were human rights. And they tend to be freedoms from things. So a right to life is the right not to be killed. Right to liberty is the right not to be imprisoned or confined. They're freedoms from things, and they are subject to agreements, treaties, and conventions and compacts, and because of that, they're not necessarily fixed, which is pretty crazy when you think about it. And this, by the way, is leaving aside one of the very important things about human rights, which is a lot of human rights and our modern understandings and conceptions of human rights have a lot to do with property and access to property. But let's leave that aside for now. This is not the space to critique the modern conception of human rights. This is a space to talk about freedom. So back to this. Because these are freedom from things, those freedoms can be taken away. And we see freedoms like these taken away all the time for anyone who violates what you might call the social contract, which is this Rousseauian idea. It has to do with the rights that you give up to a government to be protected by that government. So the government protects me, and in exchange, I give up certain rights to certain things. And if you break the rules or the compact or the laws that you have made with the government that you're under, then yes, your human rights can be taken away. And that includes the human rights, the things that are supposed to be the most fundamental things in a society, of course those can be taken away. I'm from the United States. The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is literally written into the founding document, the Declaration of Independence. But in the United States, the state kills people all the time. The state also jails people all the time. And as for the pursuit of happiness, like, we don't have the time to talk about it. But the irreducible minimum in a society is providing the basic necessities of life so that you can go and live a life, so that you can flourish in the life that you're about to live. And that is a much more powerful concept than the notion of human rights. Bookchin has a few things that he says in this book that he puts forward as things that we should base modern society around. And the irreducible minimum is one of those things. And you will see versions of this that are, I think, really tortured and kind of perverted by the time they reach our modern understanding of what they look like. So, for example, universal basic income is a modern version of what an irreducible minimum might look like. Of course, that's absurd. And I'm not arguing necessarily against UBI, because I think, yeah, it is something that you should probably fight for. But the idea of the irreducible minimum goes so far beyond something like UBI that it's almost ridiculous. And it's just important to have that in the back of your mind, that we can try to make steps and marginal changes around the margins. But really what we're fighting for is something so much more profound. And I will leave that discussion of the irreducible minimum for later as well, because this is going to keep coming up, along with the idea of usufruct and libertarian municipalism and all of this stuff. All of this will become very important later as we start to try to figure out what would a modern society that is in tune with the ecology of the world, what would that look like? We'll get to it later. For now, let's talk about justice. So Bookchin in chapter 6 is tracing the change from these early notions of freedom. And again, they're not exactly notions of freedom. These things are just, they're assumed in a society. But this early form of freedom, let's say, to our modern conception of justice now. And he traces this, he frames this as a change from equality of unequal under freedom of organic society to justice, which is unequality of equals. So again, equality of unequals to unequality of equals. And that may sound a little confusing, but basically what he's saying here is in early organic societies, of course, people were unequal. Of course, they had certain capabilities. So certain people had certain capabilities that others just didn't have. Certain people had slightly more of something than other people. These were not equals in any meaningful sense, but there was a baseline equality for everyone in that society, and it came from the idea of the irreducible minimum. They're all kind of equal. It doesn't really matter their capabilities. It doesn't matter how much work they do. It doesn't matter what they are doing or how they behave or whether they are actively breaking the laws of that society. They just get these things. They have absolute equality, even though they are unequal. Now, he says, through justice, everyone is assumed to be equal. This is the blindness of justice, right? Everyone is equal in the eyes of the law, but there is domination built into that system. Justice is a way to institutionalize these frameworks of inequality or unequality, as Bookchin says, as Bookchin frames this. So, we're all equal in the eyes of the law, but we are structured into a system of inequality, of being unequal to each other all the time. And it's worth going through Bookchin's basic story for how this happens. So we start with organic society, and organic society starts to shift as all of a sudden the irreducible minimum starts to disappear. So now, increasingly in early organic societies, you start to be compensated for the work that you do. So compensation becomes a reward. And if you work hard, you get better compensation. And if you don't work, then you just don't get compensated. The idea of the irreducible minimum starts to erode. And that takes us to ancient Greece, the times of antiquity. And in antiquity, these relationships become more of an honor code. Only for the nobility, really. But among the nobility, obligations towards others still have a moral quality to them. But it's all a moral quality in terms of an honor code that the nobility must abide by. And you can kind of see the shape of what we're eventually going to call justice developing here. Now, during this period, you also have the rise of the importance of commerce and commodities. So the old Homeric heroes, the Odysseus and the Achilles and all of this, they start to kind of fade away. These people would have been insulted to be called merchants, but now the merchants are kind of taking a little more precedence. And you have justice at the end of antiquity. As the Homeric hero starts to disappear, justice becomes a lot more commercial. Now, justice is about, safeguarding exchange and property, the notion of property. And this idea of property and exchange kind of sticks around. And after this period, you get the rise of kind of a new sense of individuality. And Bookchin throws out some names here. For example, he talks about Niccolo Machiavelli, who talks about the amorality of political life, this Machiavellian way of looking at the political world. You also get John Locke, the English philosopher, and kind of a foundational thinker in theories of justice, especially for the early American revolutionaries. So Locke starts talking about the basic right of property and also starts stripping nature, especially, of any kind of ethical content. So now, post-Locke, the subjugation of humans by other humans is celebrated. And it's celebrated because it's seen as a necessary way to bring nature under control. And then Bookchin goes to Jeremy Bentham. And Jeremy Bentham, if you've heard of Bentham, you probably know about utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is most pleasure, least pain. It's that classic trolley problem, right? Would you switch the track to save the lives of 5 people if it meant killing 1 person? This is utilitarianism, which is a bit of an absurd way to look at theories of justice, but whatever. Bentham is rolling around giving us this theory of ethics that is based on the passionless interpretation of sentiments, which is the way that Bookchin frames this. And that's where Bookchin leaves us with this idea of justice. Now, through this development, you can see how Bookchin starts to kind of frame the idea of justice. We think of justice as kind of the fundamental rules of the way that we treat other people, but Bookchin says actually it's not. What Bookchin is saying in this chapter is that justice is a way to compensate for the wrongs of a hierarchical society. Justice becomes institutionalized oppression. And legalistic justice especially strips humanity out of the equation entirely. Now, I love this idea of justice as opposed to freedom. I think it upends a lot of the ways that we tend to think about things like freedom and justice. I think Bookchin is extremely clever in this chapter and is worth really kind of reading through the ways he does this. I do think it's also important, however, to say that Bookchin himself admits that our modern understanding of justice does improve on some things from the freedom of the early organic societies, and that's especially when it comes to the rights of the stranger. So in these early organic societies, a stranger who shows up doesn't really have any rights whatsoever. He's treated just as a stranger, essentially apart from the society. And our modern theory of justice kind of says, well, these rights, human rights, whatever you want to call them, are universal. And so, as even though we don't really apply them as such at all, they still exist. And that's important. So there are ways of thinking through this concept of justice that I think are fascinating. And I think this provides us a really, really brilliant basis to go into the rest of the book and try to think through the idea of what would a modern, ecologically kind of harmonized society look like if we abandon these ideas of justice and start to look towards freedom, start to build out, you might say, an ecology of freedom. We'll get there. But for now, just hold in your head, again, the image that I started this video with, that idea of Lady Justice. Justice is about exchange, and it's about compensation. Just look at those scales. And thank you for watching. I will be back next week to talk about chapters 7 and 8. That's the legacy of freedom and from saints to sellers. We are getting into some really interesting material as this goes along. So yeah, I can't wait to tackle those. In the meantime, check out the Patreon channel, patreon.com/champagneanarchism. Also on that Patreon channel for subscribers, I am launching a 100 Great Anarchist Thinkers series that will drop every 2 weeks. And we started last week with the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, who's considered a proto-anarchist and just a fascinating. We get into early Taoism in that video, and I just think it's fascinating. So even if you're not a subscriber, you can watch that first video just to get a taste of what that looks like. So please do check that out, and I will see you next time. Thank you.